Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
My name is Lena Parker, I'm 36, and if you've ever been the older sibling who was told to just be the bigger person, then you already know what I'm about to say. Being the bigger person often just means swallowing your pride, bottling your victories, and letting everyone else take the spotlight while you pretend it doesn't sting. I learned that lesson early, and I learned it often, especially with Emily, my younger sister by 4 years, and by all accounts, the center of every room she walked into. She had that kind of natural charisma people like to call sunshine, but if I'm being honest, sunshine can burn too. And most of my life, I've been sitting quietly in the shade, holding my applause while Emily got to take every bow. So when she landed her dream job at a rising tech startup, a job she'd been gushing about for weeks, I was genuinely happy for her. Or at least, I thought I was. I showed up to the family dinner that night with a nice bottle of wine, a pressed blouse, and a smile rehearsed in the car mirror, because I knew, as usual, this night was going to be about her. She'd sent out a group text earlier that week, dinner at Mom and Dad's, got something big to announce, with 3 exclamation points and a little rocket ship emoji. That was Emily, always dramatic, always needing the stage. But what she didn't know, and what I hadn't planned to share, at least not that night, was that just hours before dinner, I got an offer for the exact same job at the exact same company. It was a coincidence so bizarre it felt like fiction. Both of us had applied without telling the other, both gone through the interview process silently, perhaps out of pride or competition, or maybe just old sibling instincts that never quite went away. And somehow, they wanted both of us. The job title was the same, but the roles were slightly different. Mine had more leadership potential, a hybrid strategy director path. Emily's was more in communications, public-facing, more sparkle than structure. I hadn't even had time to tell anyone before Dad found me out on the back porch, phone in hand, reading the email for the 3rd time like it might suddenly vanish if I blinked. He stepped out with a beer in one hand, and that same damn fatherly smirk he always wore when he was about to say something he knew would sting, but frame it like wisdom. "You gonna tell her?" he asked, nodding toward the kitchen where Emily's laugh rang out like a bell. I looked at him, unsure whether he was proud or annoyed. "I don't know," I said, half wishing he'd just say it for me. He took a long sip of his drink, then glanced at the ground like he was making some great sacrifice. "Maybe, don't mention it tonight. Let her have this moment." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Let her have this moment. Like it was a gift I could give. Like mine didn't matter as much. Like I should just tuck it away for later. And here's the worst part, I nodded. I smiled like I always do and said, "Sure, Dad." Because after 36 years of being the older sister, you learn that keeping the peace usually just means giving up your peace. Dinner started exactly as I expected. Emily was glowing, floating from one side of the dining room to the other, basking in the praise. She was wearing that red silk blouse she saves for special occasions, the one she says makes her look like a woman who knows exactly where she's going. She toasted herself before anyone else had the chance, announced her big news like she was accepting an Oscar, and even paused for dramatic effect. "They said they've never met anyone with my energy," she gushed. "Said I'd be the face of their brand." Honestly, it felt like fate. Mom was teary-eyed. Dad smiled with the calm satisfaction of a man who thinks the job of raising daughters is to prepare them for applause. And me? I just kept cutting my salmon into smaller and smaller pieces, nodding when appropriate, chiming in with "That's amazing," like a good sister should. And maybe, just maybe, I could have gotten through the night quietly, kept my promise, let her have her spotlight if the universe hadn't decided to test the limits of my patience. Because right as dessert was about to be served, the doorbell rang. Now, we live in a small town. Visits are rarely unannounced, and certainly not during family dinners. Emily's eyes widened like she'd been caught planning a surprise, and I noticed the way she adjusted her blouse and fluffed her hair before heading to the door. That was my first clue. She opened it with a sugary "Charles. You made it." And in stepped a man I instantly recognized, Charles Landon, CEO of the startup in question. Mid-40s, clean-cut, polished in that overconfident kind of way. I'd met him briefly during my second interview via Zoom, and even through the screen I could tell he was the kind of man who liked being the smartest guy in the room, even when he wasn't. He entered with a warm smile and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my car insurance. "Couldn't miss this," he said to Emily, who giggled like a teenager on prom night. She shot a smug glance around the table and whispered to my mom, "Told you he might swing by." Then he looked around the room and his eyes landed on me. There was a flicker of recognition, and he gave a polite nod before Emily jumped in to introduce us. "This is my sister, Lena," she said quickly, almost like an afterthought. "She's super smart, works in consulting, kinda boring stuff." I smiled. Bit my tongue. Again. But Charles, to his credit, didn't just let it slide. He tilted his head slightly, looked at me a second longer, and said, "Lena Parker." "Right. Actually, I think there's something I need to announce about both sisters." The room went completely still. Emily's smile faltered. Mom's hands froze on the pie dish. Dad, who had just refilled his wine glass, paused mid-sip. "And me?" I just looked up at him slowly, pulse kicking into overdrive, thinking only one thing. "Don't you dare." But Charles didn't look like a man who took cues from silence. He looked like a man who liked the sound of his own voice, and something told me this dinner was about to take a very sharp turn. There are moments in life when the air in a room changes so suddenly, so completely, that even the sound of breathing feels inappropriate, and as Charles Landon stood in the middle of our modest dining room, holding his expensive bottle of wine and glancing between Emily and me like a man about to deliver a verdict, everything else faded into a sort of suspended silence, the kind where even time seems to hesitate before moving forward. I remember the clink of Dad's fork as he set it down too carefully on the edge of his plate, the way Mom's hands clenched just slightly on the pie server, and the almost imperceptible shift in Emily's expression, where delight was beginning to tangle with something else entirely, confusion, maybe, or dread wrapped in surprise. Charles cleared his throat in a way that made it obvious he enjoyed commanding attention, a trait I had picked up on even in the brief Zoom call where he'd asked me about leadership under pressure and then interrupted me halfway through my answer to make a joke about tech startups being modern gold rushes. Now, he looked entirely comfortable taking control of the room as though it were his own boardroom, and while his tone remained friendly, I could feel the tension blooming in every inch of my body as he said, "Before I say anything, let me just say how wonderful it is to be here. It's not every day I get to have dinner with two of the most impressive candidates we've interviewed this year." There was a beat of silence where his words just hovered in the air, daring someone to be the first to react. Emily, whose expression had now shifted into something resembling panic carefully masked by a plastic smile, glanced at him and then at me, her voice just slightly too high as she asked, "Wait, two of the most impressive? You mean Lena?" She laughed, but it didn't sound real, and for the first time in years, I saw something I hadn't expected to see on her face when she looked at me: vulnerability. The kind that comes when someone who's always assumed the game was rigged in their favor realizes the deck might be shuffling. Charles nodded, completely unfazed by the rising tension, and continued, "Yes, Lena actually received an offer before yours, Emily. We were so impressed by her background in operations consulting and strategic development that we fast-tracked her application. I assumed you all had talked about it already." And with that single, casually delivered sentence, he might as well have detonated a bomb in the center of the table, because the fallout was instant and almost too much to process all at once. Emily turned to me with an expression I can only describe as betrayal wrapped in disbelief, like I had stolen something sacred from her without warning, and for a brief, raw moment, I saw the hurt in her eyes. Not the theatrical kind she pulled out during childhood arguments or failed relationships, but the quiet, unfiltered kind that stings even when you know it shouldn't. She blinked, processing, then turned back to Charles and said, "I didn't know she applied. She never told me. We tell each other everything." It was a lie, and we both knew it. We hadn't been close for years, not really. We played the part of sisters who confided in each other, who laughed over wine and shared updates, but beneath the surface, our relationship was more like two neighboring countries with a long, unspoken ceasefire, polite, measured, always one misunderstanding away from war. I didn't respond right away, partly because I didn't know what to say, and partly because the room had fallen so deeply into silence again that even my voice felt like a trespass. Charles, meanwhile, looked between us, oblivious to the emotional landmines he'd just stepped on, and added with a casual shrug, "Honestly, I was surprised to see both names. Thought you coordinated it." Then, almost to himself, he muttered, "Makes for a good story, though." A story. That's what my success had been reduced to. A quirky anecdote about sisters who accidentally competed for the same position, with no mention of the years I had spent pushing through long nights, quiet disappointments, and the constant, dull ache of feeling like the background character in someone else's highlight reel. For him, it was a punchline. For me, it was a damn reckoning. Emily finally found her voice again, though it trembled slightly when she said, "Why didn't you tell me, Lena? You know how much this meant to me." Her tone was accusatory, yes, but also filled with something deeper, a kind of desperation, as though her sense of self had suddenly become dependent on the belief that I was not competition, that I had never been competition. And standing there, I felt a lifetime of moments flooding back, the birthdays where she got the bigger gift, the school plays where she got the louder applause, the job interviews I never even mentioned because I didn't want to cast a shadow on her good days. I looked at her and said quietly, because Dad asked me not to. And just like that, every eye turned to him. He didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened in a way I recognized, a subtle tic that always showed up when he realized he couldn't control the outcome of something. He didn't deny it, though. He didn't even try to justify it. He just looked at his wine glass, then at Emily, then at me, and said nothing. That silence said everything. Emily's face twisted, not in sadness, not yet, but in pure confusion, like she had been punched by someone she trusted with her life. She stepped back from the table, mumbling something about needing air, and walked straight out the back door. Charles looked around awkwardly, clearly realizing he had stepped into something more personal than he had expected, and muttered, Maybe this wasn't the best time." And I almost laughed, because the timing wasn't the problem. The problem was the lie we had all been living. I excused myself, following the same path Emily had taken moments before, but stopped when I saw someone already standing in the backyard under the old elm tree. It wasn't her. It was Mom. She was holding a crumpled napkin in her hand and staring off into the darkness like she could will the moment to disappear. When she turned to me, I saw the tears before she could hide them. "I told him not to say that," she whispered. "I told him it would hurt you both." And in that moment, it became painfully clear. This wasn't about jobs. This wasn't about success or competition or who got the better title. This was about years of quiet choices, of subtle imbalances passed off as fairness, of a family that had built its peace on my silence. And now that silence was cracking. I looked toward the door Emily had just exited, then back at my mother, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt something in me shift, not anger, not quite, but a resolve that felt older than anything else. I had spent too many years trying to keep things nice, to keep people comfortable, to be the good daughter who never made things awkward. But something told me the days of comfort were over. And I wasn't sorry. The sky had already darkened into that dense navy that hovers between dusk and nightfall, the kind that blankets everything and muffles sounds until even the breeze feels like it's whispering secrets. I stood in the kitchen, alone for a moment, my hands still resting on the back of the chair where I had sat during dinner, except now, dinner was a crime scene, metaphorically speaking, and I was the suspect, the victim, and the unwilling witness all at once. The plates were still on the table, food cooling into uneaten clumps, glasses half full with wine that no one had taken a sip from since the bombshell dropped. There was a thick stillness in the house, a waiting kind of silence, the kind that comes after something irreversible has been said, but before anyone knows what to do with it. Emily had not returned from outside. My mom hadn't come back in either, and Charles, awkward and fumbling now, had excused himself after mumbling an apology that sounded more like a corporate statement than something human. Dad, on the other hand, stayed rooted in his chair, unmoving, like if he just sat still enough, All of this would pass without further consequence, as if silence was still a form of control. I glanced at him, wondering for the thousandth time what he was thinking, what internal calculation had led him to believe that asking me to lie about my job offer was the best move for everyone, or at least for Emily. Maybe he truly believed he was protecting her. Maybe he still saw her as the fragile one, the dreamer, the emotional center of our family, and maybe, in some buried part of him, he still thought of me as the stable one, the unshakable constant who could afford to wait, to bend, to yield. But I was done yielding. I stepped outside, the screen door creaking behind me in that slow, familiar way, and found Emily sitting on the back steps with her arms wrapped around her knees, her back curved in a way that made her look far younger than 32. For a brief moment, I saw the little girl version of her, the one who used to follow me around the yard with sticky fingers and a gap-toothed grin, the one who once cried when I got the flu because it meant I couldn't braid her hair. That version of her existed somewhere deep beneath the sharpness and ego she had grown into, and part of me longed for it, even as another part of me couldn't forgive what she had become. She didn't turn when I stepped closer, but I knew she heard me. Her voice was low, almost hoarse when she finally spoke. "You blindsided me. You applied for the same job and didn't say a word. And then you let me celebrate like a fool while you kept it to yourself." I didn't answer right away. I took my time, letting her words hang in the air like damp laundry, heavy and wrinkled with emotion. When I finally spoke, it was deliberate, measured. "You think I planned this to hurt you? You think I wanted to compete with you? Emily, I applied because I wanted the job, not because I wanted to take something from you. I didn't know we were in the same race. And when I found out, Dad asked me to step aside, just like always." She turned then, her eyes rimmed with red but still burning with that same fire she'd had since we were kids, competitive, proud, utterly incapable of seeing herself as anything but the protagonist of every story. "You could have told me anyway," she said, voice shaking now. "You knew this was my dream." "And I have dreams too, Emily," I snapped, the calm beginning to slip. "You're not the only one who wants things. But every time something good comes my way, I'm expected to dim it down so you can shine brighter. Every damn time." We sat there in silence again, two sisters who had grown up in the same house, but had clearly lived in two very different worlds. I thought maybe that would be the end of it for the night, that we would let it rest, leave the conversation unfinished like we always did, but then she said something that made me sit down slowly beside her, needing to look her directly in the face. "I reached out to Charles before my final interview," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "I name-dropped Dad's business contacts, hinted at some partnerships. I didn't know about your offer yet, but I wasn't just playing fair either. I needed this." The words hit like a slap, not because of what she'd done, but because she said it so plainly, like it was a confession that came with no weight, no shame. I stared at her, stunned, not because she had played dirty, hell, I expected that from Emily, but because she still didn't see the problem. She had manipulated the process, knowing she didn't have the same technical background, knowing her charm might only get her so far, and yet she still felt wronged. "And then tonight," I said slowly, my voice tight, "you stood there and acted like I betrayed you. Like I was the one playing games. You didn't even ask how I got the offer. You just assumed I must have snuck in behind your back." She didn't reply. And that silence told me more than anything she could have said. She wasn't sorry. She was embarrassed. She was angry that she had been caught off guard in a moment that was supposed to be her victory lap. We eventually went back inside without saying much else, and I noticed how Dad had cleared the table but not looked anyone in the eye, how Mom had retreated to the living room with a glass of wine and a quiet stare fixed on the television that wasn't even on. The family was fractured in a way it hadn't been before, not because of a fight, but because the masks had finally slipped. The roles we had all agreed to play quietly, dutifully, for years had cracked wide open, and there was no going back. Later that night, long after I had returned home and changed into sweats, I opened my email just to reread the offer letter, to remind myself that it was real, that I had earned it. That's when I saw a forwarded message from a mutual friend in the industry, someone who had been copied on an internal thread. The message had come from Emily. It was sent to Charles 2 days ago. In it, she wrote, "Just so you're aware, Lena has been struggling a bit emotionally. She's very smart, but she sometimes gets overwhelmed and shuts down under pressure. I say this as someone who knows her well. I just don't want the company to be caught off guard if she unravels during onboarding." I stared at the screen for a long time, heart pounding not from hurt, but from something darker, something cold and sharp and unmistakable. So she hadn't just tried to win. She had tried to bury me. And suddenly, I wasn't just disappointed. I was furious. Not just at her, but at myself for ever thinking I owed her silence. The thing about fury, the real kind, not the momentary flash of irritation or the bitterness that sours a conversation for an hour but then fizzles out, is that it doesn't come loudly, at least not at first. It doesn't arrive like a storm or announce itself with slammed doors and raised voices. No, real fury simmers. It builds in the silence between breaths, sharpens itself against your better judgment, and wraps itself around your bones slowly, like vines with thorns you can't feel until they've already sunk in. That night, as I sat alone on my couch, laptop glowing softly in the dimness of my living room, reading and rereading the email my own sister had sent behind my back, I felt that fury take shape, not as something I wanted, but as something I could no longer contain. For a while, I just stared at it, not even blinking, as if somehow that would make it vanish. I read each word carefully, tracing the phrases as though they were written in a language I didn't recognize. Struggling emotionally. Overwhelmed. Shuts down under pressure. It was so insidious, so calculated, masked in fake concern and written in a tone so casual you'd think she was discussing a mutual acquaintance instead of her own blood. What made it worse was that it worked. It wasn't a screaming accusation or a direct attack, just enough of a seed of doubt to cast a shadow, to make someone think twice before trusting me, to chip away at credibility I had built through nothing but work, grit, and the kind of resilience Emily never had to cultivate because she was never expected to. I closed the laptop gently, not because I wanted to be careful, but because if I didn't, I might throw it. And then I just sat there for what felt like an hour, trying to breathe through the crushing weight of the realization that it wasn't just a moment of jealousy or a heat-of-the-moment reaction. This was premeditated. She knew what she was doing. She wanted me to lose. She needed it. And in that moment, I stopped feeling guilty. I stopped second-guessing whether I should have told her about my application earlier, whether I had somehow invited this by being quiet, by complying, by playing the good daughter who never causes waves. Because I saw it clearly now, my silence had never protected anyone. It had only ever enabled them. The next morning, I called Sharon. Now, Sharon has been my best friend since college, and if there's one person in this world who could always tell when I was pretending everything was fine, it was her. She picked up on the second ring and didn't even let me speak first. "Okay," she said, already sounding half awake and half annoyed. "What happened and whose house are we burning down?" It took me a few minutes to lay it out, but once I did, she was silent for a long time, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, because Sharon isn't emotional the way I am. She's surgical. Practical. The kind of woman who would rather hand you a battle plan than a box of tissues. "Finally," she said, "so she tried to sabotage you with your future boss and still acted like you were the one who hurt her. I mean, you know what this is, right?" "What?" I asked, my voice flat. "She's afraid of you." The words landed with a thud, not because they were dramatic, but because they were so plainly true. Sharon wasn't one for poetry. She didn't do metaphors. If she said something, it was because she'd thought it through, weighed it, and decided it needed to be said. And sitting there with her words echoing in my ears, I realized how much I had let myself believe that Emily's constant need to win was just personality, just charm or drive or some innate sparkle I didn't have. But maybe it wasn't sparkle. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was panic disguised as confidence. And maybe, deep down, she always knew that if we were ever judged on the same playing field, without drama or distraction or manipulation, she'd lose. I didn't respond to the email. Not yet. Instead, I opened my calendar and scheduled a meeting with Charles. Not over Zoom. In person. And I spent the rest of the day preparing, not rehearsing excuses or apologies, but putting together a portfolio, organizing my work history, building a case that didn't just prove I deserved the role but made it impossible to believe otherwise. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to defend myself against baseless gossip. I was going to walk in with my head high and let the facts speak for themselves. 2 days later, I sat across from Charles in his office. The energy was different than before, tenser, more deliberate. He offered coffee, I declined. He asked how I'd been. I told him honestly, I've been better. Then I handed him a printed packet of my accomplishments, case studies, leadership experience, and outlined why I had applied for the role, what I envisioned contributing, and what I had planned to bring into the company if I was given the chance. He flipped through it without speaking, nodding occasionally, and when he finished, he looked up at me with that same unreadable expression from dinner. I didn't know there was all this behind the scenes, he said finally. It's not ideal. No, it isn't, I said calmly. But it's the truth. And I'm not here to explain family drama, I'm here because I want the job and I'm qualified to do it. He paused, studying me. So why didn't you fight back sooner? I gave a half shrug, not out of indifference, but because the real answer was too big to explain in one sentence. Because for a long time, I thought keeping the peace was more important than being seen. I don't believe that anymore. He nodded, slowly, and something shifted in his expression, respect, maybe, or the beginnings of it. You were always our top candidate. That hasn't changed. But it's clear we need to rethink the structure a bit. He didn't elaborate then, and I didn't push. I thanked him for his time, stood up, and walked out with my spine straight and my hands steady. And as I stepped into the sunlight outside, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, not vindicated, not victorious, but solid. Grounded. Like I had finally stepped into the space I had spent my whole life making room for but never taking. That night, I got a text from Charles. He didn't send it to Emily. He sent it to me. Let's talk about something bigger than the original offer. I've got an idea. And just like that, the balance began to shift, not because I took anything from her, but because I stopped giving everything away. There's a strange stillness that settles over you once you've crossed a threshold you can't uncross, not a loud or triumphant moment like they show in movies, but a quiet realization that something inside you has changed permanently. Like an old part of you has gone silent and made room for something sharper, heavier, more honest. That was the feeling I carried with me as I stood in front of the mirror 2 weeks after that dinner, the one where everything cracked open, and tried to make sense of the woman staring back. She looked the same, more or less, same tired eyes, same neat bun, same faint freckle near her left eyebrow that always made her look half surprised, but there was something different in her face now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before, as if she'd finally stopped asking for permission to be who she was. The conversation with Charles had changed everything, not just the job but the way I saw myself. He'd followed up that vague text with a real offer, one that was bigger than anything I had expected, a leadership track, a say in operations strategy, a team that would report directly to me, and the kind of trust that isn't handed out lightly. It wasn't just validation, it was a door I had spent years trying to find, suddenly wide open, and I walked through it without hesitation. Not for revenge. Not to spite anyone. But because, for once, I didn't owe my silence to anyone. The only person who didn't know about the offer was Emily. I hadn't spoken to her since the night she walked out of our parents' backyard, eyes glassy, jaw tight, mouth twisted in the way it always did when things didn't go the way she had planned. She hadn't called. She hadn't messaged. And, while I could have reached out, I didn't. I let the silence stretch out between us like a taut wire, wondering if she'd ever be the one to break it first, but deep down I knew better. Emily never made the first move, not when it came to apologies, not when it came to accountability. She only came back when the spotlight was on and the applause was waiting. So it was no surprise when our mother called and said, in the same tight voice she always used before bringing up something difficult, "Your father and I are hosting another dinner. Emily wants to clear the air." I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I asked what time and said I'd bring dessert. Because sometimes, showing up is not about reconciliation. Sometimes it's about being unshakably present when people expect you to fade. That evening, the house looked the same as it always had, porch light buzzing faintly, soft music drifting from the kitchen, the familiar scent of pot roast and cinnamon that clung to the walls like memory. But the air was different. I walked in and immediately noticed the tension, like static before a storm. Emily was already there, perched on the edge of the couch, dressed immaculately in her tailored blazer and heels too high for a family gathering. She looked like she was preparing for a press conference, not a conversation. Our parents hovered in the kitchen, voices hushed, glancing at us as if waiting to see which one of us would explode first. Dinner began in polite silence, everyone carefully navigating the conversation like a minefield. We talked about the weather, a neighbor's new puppy, Mom's gardening project, trivial, surface-level distractions that meant nothing and said even less. And then, halfway through dessert, just as I was about to excuse myself, Emily cleared her throat. "I want to say something," she said, voice rehearsed, eyes not quite meeting mine. "I overreacted at dinner. I was caught off guard, and I said things I didn't mean." I waited, giving her space, letting the apology, if it was one, breathe. She continued, "I was just surprised. I didn't know we were both applying, and it felt like a betrayal." There it was again, felt like. Not was. Not I betrayed you. Just the carefully worded, emotionally distanced narrative she always leaned on, one that let her admit to pain without admitting to guilt. I set my fork down gently, wiped my mouth, and finally looked her in the eye. "I understand feeling blindsided," I said slowly, "but what I don't understand is how you thought it was okay to sabotage me behind the scenes." "I saw the email, Emily. The one you sent to Charles." She froze. It was the first time I saw real fear on her face, not the performative kind, not the defensive sort, but actual dread, like she had hoped I would never find it, or if I did, that I would never bring it up aloud. Our parents looked between us, confused, clearly out of the loop, but neither of them asked for clarification, maybe sensing that they didn't want the details. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. "I didn't mean," she started, but I cut her off. "You did. You meant it. You wanted me out of the way, and when that didn't work, you played the victim. That's the truth. And I'm not here to fight with you about it. I'm just here to make sure we stop pretending." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was clean, like a wound finally exposed to air. Our father, ever the referee, finally spoke up, trying to shift the mood. "Well," he said, chuckling nervously, "at least both of you are successful now. That's something, right?" I looked at him then, really looked, and saw the man who had spent decades asking me to be the steady one, the quiet one, the accommodating one, and I realized that he hadn't done it out of malice. He had done it because it was easy. "Emily got the same offer she originally celebrated," I said calmly. "I got something different. Something more." The room went still again. I didn't elaborate, didn't gloat, didn't offer any more than that. I just let it hang there, unresolved, undeniable. Later, as I put on my coat and prepared to leave, Dad pulled me aside in the hallway, his voice low and firm in the way he only used when the mask slipped. "That was cold, Lena," he said, not angry but disappointed, as if I had broken some unspoken family rule. I met his eyes without flinching. "No," I said, my voice level and unwavering. "That was honest. You should try it sometime." He didn't respond. And I walked out of that house not lighter, not freer, but clear about where I stood, clear about who I was, and finally unwilling to carry the weight of other people's comfort at the expense of my own truth. I don't know what will happen next. Maybe Emily will change, or maybe she won't. Maybe my parents will finally see the full picture, or maybe they'll continue living in the curated version of our family where everyone plays their part. But what I do know is this. I'm done playing mine. And that, in the end, is the only ending I ever needed.